Okay, so everyone, welcome to the panel on Yvonne Vera, and we will start with Rosemary, whose presentation is titled African Feminism, African Humanism, and Extra-Anthropocentric Right-Making in Yvonne Vera's The Stone Virgin.
Oh, forgive me, that's totally impossible. All right. So, I'm going to speak my way through this. I had a PowerPoint, but then I didn't have a story, so that didn't work out. All right. So, I've been working on, I'm a chair of human rights, which is kind of contradictory because I don't actually think that human rights work, right? So this comes out of that piece. And I've just finished a book, manuscript called Communities of Affluence. It doesn't have a piece on Yvonne Vera in it. But what I'm going to do is spend some time, actually it's good that I'm going at the beginning because I'm actually doing more of a framework for reading Vera, and then maybe I'll get to read a tiny bit of the Stone Virgins at the end. So in my category of the effluent, I say that the category is, that's the effluent by the way, not the affluent, just to be clear about that. This category is constituted by its non-recognition and or irrelevance in the eyes of the state. And this is some of the work Habiba was referring to of mine earlier. And this is partly because I'm dealing with literatures of Aboriginality as well as African humanism, and what Aboriginality does, adding in literatures of Aboriginal literatures of Canada and Australasia, is point out the ways in which they do not have the option to use the state in the same way that black feminists in South Africa might do, because the state is a purely colonial settler state at this stage. Okay, so I propose that they, effluent communities do not seek the recognition of the state for their right to exist and to be. I argue for a bearing witness to such extra-anthropocentric communities as grievable on their own terms. And when I'm talking about extra-anthropocentric, I'm talking about the fact that modes of citizenship and human rights, as Sylvia Wynter would argue, are completely impossible because they are built on the genre of man or the genre of humankind. So they are secular and they're built on the notion of male citizenship. So that is where the rejection of human rights comes from. So when I talk about extra-anthropocentric human or rightness, practices of rightness, which I believe is what Yvonne Vera is practicing in her fiction making, I'm talking about imaginations that exceed or are effluent to both the citizen and normative human rights. Does that make sense, or shall I? Okay, cool. All right. So I talk a little bit about the interdisciplinary, in a negative sense, genre of human rights, and the fact that it's attached also to its not just human rights and citizenship, but in literary forms, it would be the Bildungsroman, that would be the key genre that is the concept of that sort of androcentric, anthropocentric human rights. So I seek to open up a novel sphere of non-anthropocentric human rightness in which humans practice rather than simply conceptualize rightness in relation to other humans, non-human animals, and built and natural environments. I use environments here in inverted commas because English doesn't have a word for what I'm speaking about, and environments suggest around the central human, which I'm obviously rejecting. Here, rights are not a possession of the individual, but a practice of co-constitutive ethical relations among what I term effluent communities. That is, communities whose values differ radically from those entitled citizens possess and by which they themselves are possessed. Okay. And I argue that this need for the effluent is not captured in Judith Butler's notion of disposability. And then I'm going to turn briefly to Mpahlele's practice of African humanism. All right. So let me go to the piece about Butler, rejecting Butler first, and then I'll go on to Mpahlele as I write down. I should have bought a big. Let's see if I can do it this way. There we go. Just bear with me. I'm leaving out Fanon and a whole bunch of other stuff. The narratives of affluent communities, of which my first example is Mpashele's proposed but unwritten story, prospectively entitled And the Birds Flew Away, never assume the genre of the human to be their norm or their habitus. This is not due to human rights' positioning of affluent narratives as inferior, which is indeed also the case, but due to their irrelevance to affluent subjects, so the human rights norms, their irrelevance to affluent subjects in terms of actually accessing rights, and human rights regimes' inability to comprehend non-anthropocentric forms of the imagination required for human sustainability and thriving. Affluent subjects radically deconstruct the boundaries on which the human subject depends and by which it exploits its objectified others. Further, they offer ways of conceiving of the human in terms that exceed subject-object categorization. So I'm talking about the fact that in this constitutiveness of human rights, Arendt and others, for those of you who know the literature of human rights, have argued that it's the people who most need human rights who can't access them, right? And what I'm arguing as well is that because those that need to access human rights are constituted as an object within the subject range of human rights, those constituted as objects can never be produced as subjects within the economy of human rights. Does that? Yeah, okay, good. And so some folks argue, like Joey Slaughter, that the Bildungsroman enables people like Tsitsi Dangaremba to access a certain kind of humanism. But what I argue is that he's focusing very, very much on the character of the narrator rather than Nyasha, who is the other side, who falls out of and is a sort of impossibility within the regime of the human. Okay, Judith Butler claims precarity designates that politically induced condition in which certain populations suffer from failing social and economic networks of support and become differentially exposed to injury, violence, and death. The state, however, has taught us that to be protected from the violence by the nation-state is to be exposed to the violence wielded by the nation-state, something Habiba was talking about in other terms earlier. She says that precarity characterizes that politically induced condition of maximized precariousness for populations exposed to arbitrary state violence, who often have no option but to appeal to the very state which is exploiting them. In other words, to rely on the nation-state for protection from violence is precisely to exchange one potential violence for another. There may indeed be few other choices, she says. So, I just want to move on here. In this light, we need to go beyond Butler's comments on the state in frames of war about grievability. So this is the piece in which I'm rejecting Butler's grievability. Without grievability, she says, there is no life, or rather there is something living that is other than life. Instead, there is a life that will never have been lived, sustained by no regard, no testimony, and ungrieved when lost. The apprehension of grievability precedes and makes possible the apprehension of precarious life. Grievability precedes and makes possible the apprehension of the living, being as living, exposed to non-life from the start. Okay, now that's Judith Butler. That's how she writes. But what I want to point out is she says that without grievability there is no life, or rather that there is something living that is other than life. And my problem with that is she assumes, the assumption in the back of this, which is not explicitly stated, is that you have to be grievable in the eyes of the state to have lived, right? Which is really, really difficult suggestion. So I say the question of who grieves is crucial here, and the absence of the subject, in the absence of the subject, one assumes that what Butler decries is the lack of the recognition of the state in cases of ungrievability. And I reject completely the notion that grievability is in the monopoly of the state. Affluent communities that have lived with embodied knowledge of precarity nevertheless create and have created forms of grievability that do not depend on the recognition of the state. Communities of affluent live outside or on the margins of the state in its assumptions of the good life as everyone's business. Many post-colonial communities, the indigenous and those otherwise rendered marginal, are resilient precisely because they no longer or never did believe in the capacity of the state to provide basic security, let alone any good life. Thus, affluent communities, as I describe them, live always already with a sense of grievability created in the wake of the capitalist state. So it's not the capitalist state that brings us into being, us being affluent communities by grieving us, but the fact that we live in grief precisely because the capitalist state has created the conditions in which we need to grieve. Okay? Woo! All right. So then I go on to African humanism, and I talk about the fact that one of the interesting things in African humanism from Mpahlele's perspective is he says that in African humanism there is no dichotomy between the material world and the spiritual world. There is a continuity reinforced by interrelationships and interconnectedness. That is, animal life, plant life, and inanimate objects have a life of their own, which is part of us. Okay? And then he goes on to talk about the burial of the umbilical cord in the compound and various other pieces, right? And he says, let me forget his, you can ask me about his little short story about the birds that he proposes later. So, what I want to talk about is the root cause of melancholy, probably, that Garuba points out in Mpahlele's work, is the fact that the very language of English is a very inadequate mode. I should say post-Enlightenment English is a very inadequate mode for talking about forms of practicing human rightness, which I propose in the place of human rights regimes and state regimes of rightness. Precisely because English has become saturated with first of all, it's grammar of subject and object, but then that being really underwritten by a Cartesian notion of the self and everything else as an object. So we have that grammar of colonialism, which makes grieving and object and notions of objectivity. It contaminates our notion of human rightness. And what I do with Yvonne Vera, or what I hope to do, is show two things. First of all, and I'm really going to try and stick to my 5 minutes here, which I now have 3 of. Yes. So she does two things. First of all, in the Stone Virgins, she shows how, because she's talking about Kokurahundi, right? She shows immediately how you cannot depend upon the post-colonial state. Because obviously in Zimbabwe, you go straight from the handover to the liberation movement, straight into the civil violence of Kokurahundi, right, which is state-supported, from in which the state is encouraging Shona violence against the Ndebele. So obviously there's a critique already of the post-colonial state, and that is an obvious piece in terms of the subject. What I'm more interested in some ways, because it's far more difficult to grasp, is the ways in which Yvonne Vera speaks or writes in ways that show that she is really interested in the ways in which our life, she really demonstrates in her craft, in her artistry, in her writing, the way in which our lives are intimately bound up with the earth. And so using words like environment is kind of a crappy way to go, because they once again instantiate us as the center and everything else as around us and afhang, dependent on us. And so I'm just going to read briefly here. This is the love affair of the century at the beginning of Yvonne Vera's piece. All right. Barely 2 months, and now all she wants to know. This is in the name of her lover, right? Did you say Cephas or Cephas? Cephas, I think. Cephas, it's written not from his perspective, but not from his narrative point of view. Barely 2 months, and now all she wants to know is the name of the fruit caught between her teeth. Just that and nothing more, nothing about him. So in this, Cephas is her lover, right? And she doesn't see a distinction between trying to figure out the seed. Now the seed was brought with Kefas from his part of Zimbabwe that he lives in. And it's completely different from Kezi where she lives, right? And he just sees this as her being distracted from him. Meanwhile, for her, it's all about trying to figure out how he lives, because the seed cannot live in Kezi. It's not the right environment. So if they're going to come together, they have to figure out now how these seeds, which grows in which area, are going to work, right? Just that and nothing more. Nothing about him. Only the lost flavor of that fruit. She is possessed by the dry sweetness she has roused from its hard skin. And of course he doesn't understand this is about him, right? Her tongue seeks it like comfort, and now she makes love to him with panic and envy, as though he is an unreliable lover. She rises out of his embrace only to sip some water held in a tin cup on the side of the bed, and to ask him on what soil the mazanje, is that right? Can somebody correct me? Mazanje? Grows. How long before each new plant bears fruit? How fertile its branches? How broad its leaf? She rises to ask what kind of tree the seed comes from, the shape of its leaves, the size of its trunk, the shape of its branches, the color of its bloom, the measure of its veins. Okay. The measure of its veins. Eh? So it's like the tree is him and her, right? That she needs to know the measure of its veins. Does it even bloom? Does it indeed bloom? Which animal feeds on its fruit, on its leaves, and can its branches bear the weight of a child? More than that, more than a child. And he still doesn't understand it's about potentially having a child with him. I mean, how doof can you be, right? Could it grow on the edge of a cliff or a hanging incline, near a river, inside the river? Now, the last thing, I need to wrap up now. So the last thing I'm going to say is this is a language in which literature is not metaphorical, but metonymical, right? So she's not producing, can the branches wear the weight of a child? You could argue this is metaphorical in the sense that she's trying to figure out through metaphor, can I have a child with you, and can we manage that, and can we do it successfully? That's the metaphorical way. The metonymical way is that having a child is not separate from the strength of the actual tree to bear a child. Do you see what I'm saying? Is that making sense? Okay. So I'm suggesting that we have a habit of reading metaphorically because of the disembodiedness of our association with how we're taught to read English texts, right? But Yvonne Vera forces us to read this in an embodied aspect. And so it makes sense that it makes sense that the harmer in this novel, the person who harms, the person who rapes and kills, eventually takes himself off to die in a place where there are bones of his colleagues from the war. He's in a sense going home as far as that goes, and she has the most extraordinary empathy for the violator in the Stone Virgins. So that was very short, but I hope I managed somehow to show an approach to reading her in relation to practices of human rights, of which I think she's the most exemplary model of writing.
Thank you so much. Then we move to the second paper by Jessica, titled "The Small Voice of Craft in Yvonne Vera's Fiction."
Thank you. So I maybe need to start by thanking Sarah Kaesner, who proposed this panel and put us together, and unfortunately then was the one person not able to join us, which seems really unfair. But I am recording so that she can at least listen to us later. I wrote a PhD on Yvonne Vera quite some time ago, and I then left that work. I finished my PhD the year that she passed away, in 2005. And I think that many of the things we've been hearing from the keynotes over the last couple of days might be the reasons why I lost my nerve. I didn't know what business I had continuing to work with this literature. I don't have a personal connection to Zimbabwe. I grew up in Indonesia, and I went to study my MA, and the Indonesian literature course was cancelled, and I was too young to wait 6 months, and fell in love with literature from somewhere else. But we have heard such fascinating comments about being located and being grounded and speaking from the personal, and I think that after my PhD that troubled me too much. I got quite stuck on that as a challenge until very recently, when Sarah and I met through the internet, and I learned that Yvonne Vera's archive has opened in Toronto in Canada, where she wrote her own PhD and where she passed away. How do I move?
In a grounded way.
Am I doing something wrong? Clearly I'm doing something wrong. Did you? Aha, okay. Thank you very much. And so in an effort to come back to this material with any sense of what I legitimately have to say, I realized that I am a lot more comfortable now drawing on what I've done for the past decade, which is I've always worked in the context of visual arts, and I'm fascinated by how visual arts practitioners write about their practice, something that in Europe in particular is now an obsession at PhD level study, is this heavy, and I can hear the crossovers in literary studies, this very heavy academic discourse that is being demanded around practice. Some of you might know that along with the unbelievable fiction that Vera wrote, she worked as the director of the National Gallery in Bulawayo, and her writing and its visual nature is something that clearly was what drew me as a visual person, a visual, half literary person, actually probably a lot more visual person, to the writing in the first place, and maybe now is the only place I'm comfortable speaking back to. I also have recently started to recognize that we need to give each other the space to retract things that we have published in the past. If we are to have, please, if we are to have any hope of an academic discourse that we actually have any comfort with, without maybe horrifying each other along the way. And so I wrote a PhD called The Voice of Cloth. I was obsessed with the metaphors in her writing, along with the symbols and along with structurally how it works. But I regret that writing quite significantly. And the thing that I've come to understand is, and it chimes so well with what we've just heard about the request to broaden our understanding of methods, and if people are on editorial panels to think a little bit more openly about what we want to claim as voices and methods, because I think I made the textile so important in her writing because I felt like I had to. I felt like that's how you wrote a PhD. And I'm not saying that I don't think these things are important, but I think I totally overdid it, massively overdid it. And so what I've done more recently, and you can imagine again that this is an enormous. My job title is Professor of Crafts, and what I've wanted to do was talk about what craft can't do in Vera's writing, what it's too small to do, and this doesn't go down very well through a peer review process. You people actively say, why would a professor of crafts be interested in in actively trying to show what something can't do. It just makes people's heads really, really hurt. And the more I got that feedback, the more interesting it became to me. This idea that craft is a very new academic discipline, quite particular to the Scandinavian region. And there is a sense that as a subject enters the university as a new topic, again, what you claim is how big it is, how important it is, otherwise you're somehow not doing your job. And that gets to be an out-of-control tornado as well. So instead, I'm fascinated with her comments about how she uses the photograph, and we're not going to have a lot of time for this, but this is quite a well-referenced comment that she made about how she began to write her version of the story of Nahanda. And she points out that she wanted to write beyond the photograph, beyond the facts. And she talks about that, and she talks in many interviews about holding a real photograph, a real image or an object on her desk as she's writing, but not because that is truth or because that is what she's trying to capture. This idea of writing behind or outside the frame of the photograph, the things which could not be pictured. And so now I'm torn between this fascination of her as such a visual writer, and clearly her use of visual triggers to help to tell her stories, and what I then got rather mixed up in and have now wanted to retract, which is that doesn't mean that that's how those things operate in her stories. And I think it's also Sarah's PhD, which you supervise, that's given me the confidence also to realize that these things that are very unfixed in her writing are very, very much intentional in her point. And so jumping back and forth between is craft important, is textile important in her writing or not, is part of the flexibility of a lot of the way she deploys language. So she refers herself to her visual fascinations. This moment, frozen like it is so powerful that I can't lose sight of it visually or emotionally. From it I develop the whole story, the whole novel. Everything ripples around that. The story grows out of the image. The entire history is contained in such a moment. And I'll skip over this. So I've written recently about going back to some of the craft practitioners that are described in her first collection of short stories, and rewriting what I had read earlier, which is to say that a lot of those moments in those stories, I think, act as counterpoints to show how little these activities, such as making models out of wood, repairing shoes, how little they can change in the circumstances around them. So this isn't somehow that craft can change the world, which I know I'm at a literary conference, the world I usually speak in. Unfortunately, that's what we talk a lot about, and it needs an antidote. It needs to be balanced with something else that says reasonably they can't only be treated as metaphor, as you just said. So for time, I will skip over this. I mean, this is the shoemaker in Why Don't You Carve at Other Animals. It's easier to deal with an old shoe than with an old memory. So this is where I am fascinated and also get confounded by her writing, is this power that these things are given because of what they're set against. And this particular character goes in such a powerful description to visit his family, and the way he visits his family is by drawing his curtains closed and closing his eyes, because he doesn't have a family or a village anymore to go and visit, not that physical, and so this is traveling in his mind. And then something very grounded, such as craft and the shoe, becomes this very small thing that acts as a counterpoint to that idea. So as I said, I, with trepidation, returned to this material because the archive has opened in Canada, a very, very, very complex archive. That's for another conversation. But I was, I suppose, looking for photographs, looking for her visual, this visual person that I felt I possibly had a tiny bit more of a right to analyze or to speak to this fascination of how she turned the visual into words. There is a manuscript that is unpublished and will remain unpublished, but it's in the archive. And I sat on my flight and told myself I would not read this manuscript because it's unpublished for a reason, because people close to her believe it wasn't resolved and therefore doesn't meet the qualities of the writing she was able to complete during her life. And of course then I got there and I couldn't not have a little peek at it. And so I feel like a fraud even doing this, because I said, no, I respect those people, this is a really good decision, and then it was there in a box. Even though I hadn't asked for it to be taken out of storage, I thought, oh, I just have a little look at it. And so I say this only again because of my interest. The only way I feel I have an authority to access this work now is this relationship with the visual. And she describes these small carvings, and what is wonderful to see in the archive is that you can see the material she was studying, to the point that it's even underlined and circled some of these physical descriptions. And I say all of this, I'm running out of time already, because I think in addition to all of the other ways that we can treat and talk about this unbelievable writing that we're left with from this author, is a little request that we also recognize the creative mind that she was and the imagination that she had. The question that the curators were asked yesterday. And maybe I say this selfishly because coming from the work that I do now, I think that sometimes those things get a little bit flattened in some of our conversations. This was an exhibition that she curated. I'm going to run over it. It was a photography exhibition, fascinating because it called on the community to bring in photographs. The topic of it was desire. Again, our Thursday morning conversation. And then it was really harshly reviewed by somebody who said she needed to have defined desire and it wasn't historically situated enough. And I read through this review and just thought, but that's fascinating. That's also exactly the way some people have responded to Vera's writing. You know, please be clearer in your agenda. When this was an incredibly creative, imaginative mind that doesn't really deserve quite to be hijacked in that way. And I have to say that I suppose my explanation for why I sit in the visual arts and in crafts and look back to fiction is that if fiction authors are referring to the textile or to craft, they will be doing it without an agenda. So myself and all of my colleagues, we write about the crafts, unfortunately, with a rather large agenda. Let's make these things mean more. But I'm fascinated by the fact that when I move back into my original education in literature, it will be there because it's working, because it's fascinating, because it's contributing, not because of some academic agenda to raise the profile of craft or textile. So I end just with some wonderful comments that Vera said about her own writing process, which I think in our celebration of her sometimes get a little bit lost or flattened out. She talks about, this is an edited volume that she wrote, an introduction that she wrote, that women writers need to invent new gods to banish ineffectual ones. And then this, I wonder, is a little bit less how her writing has been attended to recently. People forget that writing is not just about issues, such as the ones you and I have been discussing. Ranka Primarak is trying to understand who she read and what her influences would have been. But writing is also a fulfilling search for expression. She's really talking about something very embodied, and not necessarily, you know, again, conforming to these sort of academic rules that we have. My first commitment is to the act of writing, and again, this is absolutely a creative process rather than a very strategic, intellectual this is how I'm going to get my next promotion process. Especially finding a particular voice, a voice for a particular story. Once I have it, I'm so liberated and excited, I'm not considering the audience. I'm considering characters, the story, you know, the whole creative act that she's immersed in, which we then afterwards totally forget about and try and pin everything back into a tidy history. I wouldn't write if I were not in search for beauty, and if I was doing it to advance a cause. I tried in my PhD to talk about the remarkable beauty in her writing, and I was really laughed out of the room that we talk about something sensible here. What were the politics that were going on? You want to talk about beauty, and you don't understand the politics. I think we could rebalance those things. I want to be consumed by figures of beauty, by the story, by the character. It must be about perfection. I think that's actually a very good reminder of why I should have possibly stayed away from the obedience manuscript and people were correct. And then these, sorry, I'm out of time here, but I was obsessed with the photograph, and so this is a very young Vera that I found in the archive as some type of passport photo. And here is her very early voice talking about her introduction to writing as a child and writing on her body. Our hope increased as we travelled downwards to the legs where the skin broke like black clay, and we wrote our names to all eternity. Here we wrote near the bone, and spread the words all the way to the ankles. She's talking about as children how she entertained herself. But then she concludes with something that I think is a really important thing to try and hold on to when we try to go back and continue to relish her writing now, that it wasn't necessarily always about the heaviness that we read in it now. It was possible, when you'd used a small piece of dry bark for your pen, to be bleeding in small dots. Such words could never depart or be forgotten, but that was bleeding, not writing. And then she ends by saying it was important to write. So I hold on to that as my permission now to go back and say I've made some mistakes, I'd like to write and not bleed. But also maybe ask that in all of these conversations we hold open a little bit more space for also celebrating what a remarkable creative mind she was, alongside our other strategies for how we read these things, which are needed and valid, but not to forget that, and that a lot of these things were written maybe without some of the plans that we somehow press on them as we read back over them now, because they were incredibly creative moments that she describes working in. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you. And lastly, we have Thando's paper titled Grief, Song and Feminist Utterance in the Patriarchal World of Yvonne Vera's Under the Tongue.
So I just want to start off by giving a brief synopsis of the actual novel, just in case you haven't read it. So the novel is told from two perspectives, which are juxtaposed. The first one is the first perspective, first person perspective of a child who is mute after having been raped by her father, and her name is Ziza. Now, Ziza is the daughter of Runyarara and Muroyiwa, his father is called Vagomba, who is blinded by a landmine explosion in the family's field during the second Chimurenga in Zimbabwe. So I'm just going to go straight into it because I don't have much time. So the novel is characterized by dominant themes of silence, inertia, violence and death. Themes which are intimately woven into the psychosocial fabric of the context the characters inhabit. So this thematic emphasis, thematic emphasis draws similarities between gendered violence and toxic masculinity, and extends to the invisible hand of colonial domination, which is never explicitly mentioned in the novel. Although not given as much attention as Ziza's rape in the scholarship, Zimbabwe's second Chimurenga, as a result of which Vagomba loses his sight, plays a crucial role in Murayiwa Haddad's upbringing. Before Murayiwa is born, sorry, I've just said that, okay. So Vagomba is inconsolable after losing his sight. And shortly thereafter, well, yeah, shortly thereafter he also loses both of his sons to a war from which he appears never to recover. This war, which together with the precarious conditions under which Murayiwa grows up, are exacerbated by the debasement which accompanies poverty, rendering Murayiwa incapable of incestuous rape in the first place. So, because both Murayiwa and Ziza are predominantly silent characters in the novel, I argue that the child's silence following the rape is established in a dialectical relation to that of her father, and that therefore any discussion of Ziza's subjectivity must be read in relation to her father's own traumas, which began at the very moment of his birth. The narrative of Murayiwa's life verges on the mythical. Having died at birth and having been reborn inside a calabash, he was originally meant to be buried in. He re-enters the world of the living without a biological origin based on the mother's body. He has been interpreted as a Lazarus figure, as an infantilized man with a childlike dependence and amorality. As a young boy, he's simultaneously perplexed and fascinated by his mutilated father's blindness, often mimicking the latter's movements and gestures. It was as though Murayiwa had been born into his father's blindness, and it received and contained him like a vessel which recalls the calabash coffin in its symbolic resonance with death. When he's tasked with assisting his father in the fields, there are hardly any words exchanged between father and son. Not much spoken, no instructions given, no expectations raised. Vagomba had no wisdom to impart. He continued to plough the fields. Murayiwa followed his father like a breathless shadow. Vagomba's growing indifference to the world of the living, following his blindness, is a story that he never relates, except he said that something truly tight had risen from the earth and unbound him, separated him from himself. And this something is inextricably linked. It's English, guys, I can't. Inextricably linked to his silence and represents a physical trauma which has significant repercussions, primarily among which is the inability to fully participate in his own life as an agent in charge of his own fate. The distance and disconnection between him and his son manifests in a gulf of silence between them, and Murayiwa readily embraces this as the natural state of being in common. Murayiwa regards his father's detachment from life with an emotion akin to jealousy, because he experiences the spectral presence of the root which blinded Vagomba as an unspoken object which stands between him and a meaningful connection with his father. After going blind, Vagomba's relation to the world is transformed into a sensual rather than a linguistic one. His sense of being in the world is predicated on his ability to touch objects around him and to feel the warmth of the sun on his skin. The young Muriiwa mimics his father's tendency to run his hands over objects in order to identify them. For instance, Vagomba uses his hands to feel the face of his son, to know that he's there, obviously, to identify him. So this tender moment between them is the only time Muriiwa reportedly feels recognized by his father. Recognition to Muriiwa made you feel like your skin, like you had skin separating you from air. It was something like that, to do with skins and bodies. For Vagomba, touch denotes a remembered connection to the world from which his blindness shut him out. And despite being amused by his father's touching of his face and mimicking his use of his hands to recognize things, the significance of the ritual is lost on Muriiwa. Instead, the boy's imitation goes no further than literally touching the surface of things. The distance in the significance of touch between Vagomba and Muriiwa escalates as the boy grows older, because the two are not able to communicate using speech. There is thus a macabre continuity between Muriiwa's tendency to gravitate towards death, his fascination with his father's blindness, and his problems with healthy attachments with those close to him. Muriiwa's stunted attachment to his father is further compounded by the losses which accompany war and colonial spatial planning, which designated black Zimbabweans to live in the township. Each crouching house is hedged, and the people are confined therein. The corrosive consequences of these abject conditions play themselves out in the more private realm of the small three-bedroomed house in which Ziza's family attempts to forge livable lives after the war. The township is described as a crumbling place with no edifice to it, no foundation, but necessity itself. The township housed workers, not families. The people had been wooed from their villages to the township, but others had been born there in the din of misery. This description underscores the material conditions the characters confront. They had built the township, Ziza's grandmother later tells her. "I do not like it here. We live like bees." And later she asks how they would go about burying people, how you get buried in a place that was never meant to contain life in the first place. So Ziza is born under these dire circumstances, and the consequences of this constellation of circumstances, is reflected when she experiences the most intimate of violations. Okay, so I skip over this. So essentially, when Muriiwa returns from the war, he becomes a miner in something that reflects some of the migrant worker, where another sense in which the novel replicates his attention, his propensity for death, in being put down a mine shaft. He was essentially being buried and then being reborn again at the end of his shift. So there's a sense in which the very lives of the miners reflect a sense of the living dead, in a way. So Ziza, after she's raped, she has to be sort of initiated out of her silence by her grandmother, who tells her stories about her own life and sings to her. And Ziza admits that I have forgotten the song of my growing, thereby intimating that her muteness is a function not only of her inability to speak, but also to regain a sense of harmony. Ziza's grandmother's singing, therefore, occupies a space between the unspeakable contained in Ziza's silence and the silence which accompanies her own and Rinyararo, who's Ziza's mother's, grief. So from the very outset, Ziza identifies her grandmother's singing as a carrier of memory. While preparing herself to inform Ziza that her father has died, for example, her grandmother sings. And observing this, Ziza claims, grandmother would teach me many forgotten songs. It is through her songs that Ziza's grandmother is able to access Ziza's fortress of silence. Something which, as Ziza herself explains, embraces all my fear. And because she's no stranger to grief herself, grandmother's song, Ziza explains, enters my growing and finds parts of me hidden and still and alone, full of the forgotten things of the earth. The forgotten things which her grandmother passes on affirms the beauty and power of the women's shared connection as creators. Her singing thus performs, okay, sorry, how many minutes do you have now? 4, 7, great, thank you. Vagomba has 2 sons who are Muriwa and Tachivei. Okay, so Tachivei goes off to war, he presumably dies, but before he goes, he carves a stool, which is the first stool that he's ever made, with a lizard, with its tail taken off. So after he leaves, his father starts carving the same kinds of stools. So there's a sense in which he's connecting with the loss of his son, and a sense in which this is unfulfilled because it's sort of a manic, he keeps carving stools over and over again. So this sense in which his grief is never resolved, which kind of links in with his inability to mourn. Whereas where the women are concerned, Ziza's grandmother sews and makes mats, and her mother also makes mats, which she learned from her mother. So the male line, basically, they don't speak. They engage in compulsive actions which never really reach the fruition of actually resolving their grief. Whereas the female line, they, as Ziza's grandmother says, we use words to bury our grief. So they're very much, there's a juxtaposition between a potential for artwork that, as a means of grief, and weaving in terms of words, basically narrative, to deal with grief. So while the male line never quite reaches that, the female line actually does. So as part of grandmother's creative actions, her singing performs what Vagomba's repetition of Tachivei's stool carving could not. It brings to bear the potential for healing through remembrance within the family's traumatic cosmos. And that's where I'm going to end.
Yay.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think I'd like to open up the floor for questions, comments, postscripts. That people feel they want to say the last thing that they didn't have time to say.
I'd like to make a comment on your paper, if that's okay. I don't think that I don't think that what you're arguing is diminishing craft as much as you suggest, in that what you seem to be talking about, or what you seem to be saying that we shouldn't lose about Yvonne Vera is the craft of improvisation, because she can't use, I mean, the tool, as I have argued, but the tools that are there as models are already so corrupt and part of the problem, that she's really into a writing which I would argue is a practice of improvisation. And so the relationship of that to craftsmanship is a really interesting one to start weaving. Do you know what I mean? So I think there might be a link between an improvisational approach to craft and the craft of writing. If that makes any sense.
Yes, no, it absolutely does. And the comments you've just raised about craft and repetition and compulsion, and whether it can bring about anything or not. It's in craft scholarship at the moment. There are big debates, frankly, about what type of craft we're talking about, which is probably a subject that every academic discipline deals with, and it's a huge word. And fascinated me yesterday. The curators yesterday, they were referring to craft as the decorative, the not politicized, and part of the challenge in craft scholarship is, at least in English, not in other languages, but in English, the word is so broad that it covers so many things, and it can be about repetition of entrenched skills and preservation of that, which is highly problematic in these circumstances that we're talking about, and it can be something extraordinarily creative and likened to song or food production or all of these other, in a much more improvisational mode. And maybe it was about that I needed to have brought more clarity to that.
Okay, no, there's just a...
I wondered what the response had been to your work on Vera, the work that you want to undo now. And I wondered whether you should undo, and I don't know what that undoing is going to look like. But I thought, well, we all respond to texts from our particular positions, and you were also, and you read it in the way in which you read because you're from craft. And that's why I suppose I wondered then, what was the response, either from people in your world or outside of that world, to what you now want to throw out the window?
So the response in my PhD viva, which I'm happy to talk about because I don't think these secrets should remain hidden, was that in focusing so much on what the textile as a voice in her writing, which was my obsession, I didn't attend enough to the political circumstances in which she was situating her writing, and that was an ignorance on my part. But again, I do understand that these also have a lot to do with how you make that argument, and if I had possibly positioned myself more clearly, I would have got away with it in a different way. But I do think that attention, particularly to metaphorical meaning, was a bit of a red herring. That I think structurally, and the weaving mats and the damaged structure of the family because of incest, and the attempting to then create these mats which have a beauty in their structure, those were probably slightly more useful readings than me dwelling in the metaphor. More recently, working more with craft scholarship, and this sits across other types of literatures as well, certainly not just Vera's or Zimbabwean, that we still have to pay a lot of attention to the realities of how these things are constructed. They're very, very poor financial remuneration compared to the arts more generally, which isn't good, but then crafts are even lower. Those so there's started to be quite a backlash against romanticizing these things, which I think I probably got a little sucked into and is what I'm interested in stepping out of a bit.
Thank you to the panel for really great papers. And my question is for Rosemary, and I wanted to ask you to explain a little how in Pashlele you see the human, because of course you were troubling that category of the human in the human rights discourse. But I wondered if you could just expand a little bit, and also what is the text you were drawing on, because I arrived a little bit late and I wondered whether I just maybe missed that reference. So was that the unfinished story,
yes,
or was that... Okay.
That's the unfinished story, and let me just...
So what kind of a human
right.
is that?
So one of the things that has happened with, that I argue in detail here, that has, so I think let me just repeat your question to make sure I'm going to answer the right question. You're asking, it might seem a little odd perhaps to choose in Pashlele African humanism to move to Yvonne Vera. Is that?
No, just, answer, yeah.
Oh, okay. So what I'm doing is I'm pointing out that, you know, this is Marlene Orbis-Philippe says this, and you were pointing this out as well, that, you know, English is a foreign anguish, right? So what happens in this, in the you like that one, eh? What happens in the appropriation of Mpashlele in a notion of African humanism is the diminishment of the fact that everything that he says is to some degree in translation, right? So there's this complete focus on African humanism as relating to a male subject when there isn't actually a gendered pronoun in Zeke's first language, right? So, but I'm also interested in the way, if you read his English, there's a tension. So he keeps, and I read his interviews, and I point out that he, on the one hand, looks like he's a kind of straight African humanist. But every now and again, he comes up with these places where it's very clear that he's not talking about the human subject as that which fits in with the genre of the human. So he keeps on, he says that he wants to write this novel called And the Birds Flew Away, right? And then he dies before he can write it. But in it, he says, the birds fly away. Now, they don't fly away, and then there's all grief because they fly away, because they're weaver birds, which we know fly away on a regular basis. They're, you know, how do you say, seasonal. What he says is that the neighbors and everybody has forgotten how to hear and to speak to the birds, right? And he also has a long series of practices around something that Kabiba was mentioning, which is the lack of appropriate ritual in terms of the burial of the umbilical cord when the child is born with the ancestors, to keep the conversation between the ancestors and the living going. And so what I'm trying to point out in that, if you read this kind of queer reading of Mpashlele's humanism, leads us to something that we can see potentially Yvonne Vera being, that might help us to link Yvonne Vera's strangeness to a tradition in African cultural writing, in sub-Saharan African cultural writing, that tries to point at these spiritual elements that we all feel are missing from a discourse that has cut out any kind of religion or spirituality, but are actually there. It's just that the repeated ways of mutilating these discourses, partly through their inferior transliterations and translations into English, and partly through our inability to see the words originally used in a much fuller context, renders these notions of African humanism as caricature. Does that?
Yeah, that's...
As secular caricature. And what is it with this old man in Pashlele that thinks that we still have the space to bury the umbilical, you know, that kind of thing. Renders it as original tradition.
Okay, it's a rambling, but as you were speaking about how song is part of what managed to pierce through that fortress of silence after the rape, it made me think of Maya Angelou's experience of rape also, and how she also went silent after that experience. And in her case, it wasn't song, but it was literature. One of her grandmother's friends used to call her over and coaxed her out of that silence using literature. And I know you hadn't finished your paper, but I wondered how does all of that then, how do you trace all of that to, I suppose, when I look at your title, Grief Song and Feminist Utterance, how do you wrap it all up and make it a statement about the feminism and what's going on?
Well, I think my primary answer to that is that feminist utterance isn't just linguistic. So it's not about, although words are important, it is, you know, it's the grandmother's storytelling as well. She tells stories, she sings, she weaves things. So there are certain sort of gestures. She touches her as well. So there's a sense in which feminist utterance is sort of extra linguistic in a way. So it's whereas the men are unable to touch each other, they're unable to speak to each other, they're unable to transfer any kind of intimacy. So it is about intimacies and being able to having the capacity to be intimate, to pass on something, whereas the women do.
And I think it's been said in this conference in many other ways, but that awakening of the sleeping self, remembering, being able to reach a part of herself that she's closed off through, as you say, not the language, but another language.
There is also, if I'm trying to add to that, just,
Yes.
I think there's also a theoretical aspect of that, which is that, sorry, this comes from, like, in about 3 days I'm going to be doing a workshop for severely sexually abused writers. So this is linked to that in the sense that the language that we have, very much like Habiba was referring to the state, has a kind of convention to it, right? That if we don't assign certain meanings in the convention, you know, as Judith Butler says, we end up sounding like babbling because there's no agreed sense on the convention. The trouble with the agreement with the convention to make ourselves coherent is it's associated with patterns of stigma that do not enable language to be an adequate speaking cure in the wake of rape, which coincides completely with your arguments.
And Vera herself, when interviewed, has talked about all of the language that she purposefully avoided, or
in order not to invoke these patterns.
to try. Even to the comment of regretting, I believe it was the word pregnancy, or even one term that she worked so hard to try and construct that fluidity, or to not find those traps. That's then also the criticism of whether it's concrete enough to follow, which is a bit disingenuous.
Well, it's also a very, very disheartening, vomitive repetition of the critique of Bessie Head's question.
I think we can wrap up the session. Thank you very much.
Thank you.